the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
We are all familiar with one of those old sayings. We all are familiar with lots of old sayings, but there's one that says, what you see is what you get. I think many of us have sort of worn that as a badge of pride when we talk about ourselves. What you see is what you get. The reality is that we are very fortunate that with God, it doesn't always work that way. With God, what you see is not always what you get. If you listen to the second reading today, those of us who are advancing rather quickly in age like this reading, because St. Paul reminds us that if we're in Christ, the new has come. I just wish I didn't look so darn old on the outside. But God in Christ is constantly renewing us, transforming us, making us his new creation. In fact, I find it interesting, very few people ever quote this part of the Revelation of John. In the 21st chapter, God looks at the created order and he sums up his creative activity with a simple line. He says, behold, I'm making all things new. I'm making all things new. Even an old guy like me is being made new. And so as we gather today to express sacramentally this basic principle in confirmation, reaffirmation, reception, Holy Eucharist, we are in fact expressing a belief that God is making all things new. And today in this place especially, we need to be reminded of that because we are celebrating your patronal festival, the feast of St Augustine of Canterbury. A very interesting man, a monk, who spent most of his early life leading a rather isolated existence in a monastery. I don't mean to imply that monastic life is easy, but it's not like working for a living. In the world where you have families and jobs and all of those kinds of things to deal with, Augustine was isolated from that kind of existence. Imagine his surprise when the Bishop of Rome, Gregory, his former prior at the monastery, sent a message one day saying, have I got a deal for you? He summoned Augustine and said, I'm sending you with a group of monks to a distant place. And I'm sure I can hear Augustine say, well, where exactly is it you're sending me? And he said, well, it's sort of near France, but on the other side of the channel. Imagine Augustine's response. You're not sending me to those savage Anglo-Saxons, are you? Yes. And so Augustine set out with something less than a vigorous response. We actually know he got as far as France and decided to go back and ask if perhaps maybe the Pope had made a mistake. You did say England, didn't you? Maybe we could go someplace else, like Bavaria. They have good sausage there. Augustine had to face a whole new world for him. The Anglo-Saxon people were, for the most part, non-Christian. Augustine thought he would be planting the church in the British Isles. The Roman Empire had been gone for over 100 years. And in his estimation, so was the church. Imagine his surprise when he arrived on the Kentish coast and he discovered that Christianity was everywhere in the western part of the British Isles, even as far as Ireland, and that it was a fully organized church with its own bishops, its own practices, a Christianity with an unbroken history of several hundred years. And he's down in the corner with these Anglo-Saxons, trying to convince a king by the name of Ethelred, who fortunately had married a Christian princess. You all know how that messed up. trying to convince him that Christianity was the way for the Anglo-Saxon people. Now, I don't mean to imply it was easy, but in the end, Augustine accomplished what God had called him to do. Behold, he took something very old and made it new again. God, through Augustine's work, renewed the English church. We owe a great deal to that man for his second trip to the British Isles through France. Our heritage, who we are as God's people, comes directly from his renewing presence in the midst of the church in England. Not that it was easy, not that it was simple, but his willingness to step outside his own comfort zone, to be sent into a world that was unfamiliar to him, in spite of the fact that he was living a very comfortable, what in his mind was an ordinary existence. God had more in store for him. He became Archbishop of Canterbury, a wonderfully celebrated position, the first Archbishop